Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's De Morgan Foundation talk on St. George and the Dragon. And on that note, we acknowledge that it is the feast day of St. George today, so happy St. George's Day to everybody, wherever you are in the world, today on the 23rd of April. The keenly aware amongst you may have noticed that if you go to your Google homepage today, whilst sadly not a De Morgan Google Doodle, you can click a link just underneath the search bar, which will take you to a rather nice story using the De Morgan Foundation's collection and telling a little bit more about the story of St. George and elaborating on some of the aspects that I'll cover in today's talk. So that's sort of been a long time coming, and I'm really pleased to announce to everybody today that we've managed to get that rather wonderful bit of publicity and press through our partners at Google Arts and Culture today. So after the talk, please do go away and have a look at that, and like I said, learn a little bit more about St. George. To start the talk properly, so St. George, who was he? I think we're quite used to seeing St. George and thinking of him in his usual depiction, which is very similar to this one from the Italian Florentine school, which you can see at Cyfarthfa Castle and Museum in Wales. This is a 15th century depiction of St. George, and there he is in his chivalric armour, holding a shield emblazoned with the cross, the red cross of St. George on a white background, and this little dragon here at the bottom of the page. And this story and this idea of St. George has been passed down to us from the Golden Legend, which is a 13th century collection of stories on the lives of saints. And George was a 3rd century chivalric knight who slayed a dragon to rescue a princess from being its supper. And that's very much how we see him, proud and heroic and chivalrous. It's probably closer to the truth, however, that St. George actually was a 3rd century Roman soldier from Cappadocia in modern day Turkey. He was sort of famed and given a sainthood at the time, or sort of revered at the time, for objecting to Rome's persecution of Christians in his own time, and he was actually imprisoned and tortured by Emperor Diocletian, but remained true to his faith. So that was his martyrdom. He was beheaded at Lydda, and his tomb was later brought west to Western Europe by the Crusaders, and he was especially popular in Venice, probably indicative of why we have so many Italian depictions, or depictions by Italian artists, of this patron saint. And many of his relics were actually collected in Genoa as well as in England, so his patron saint of England. Although George never visited England in his own lifetime, his reputation for virtue and holiness had spread across Europe, and his feast day, as I've mentioned, which is today, the 23rd of April, has become widely celebrated in England from about the 9th century onwards. He was particularly popular with English kings Edward I and Edward II, but it was actually under the reign of Henry VIII where, sort of through, I think, the Reformation and trying to look for more secular, perhaps, stories rather than the exact act of God, to lean and pin onto the Church of England and have this real idea of an English national faith, which of course Henry VIII tried to do when he set up the Church of England in order to divorce his first wife, that really we start getting the images of St. George being popularised, and that again, like I said, was around the medieval period. So this great chivalric story of the dragon was attached after them. It may also be of interest to note that St. George isn't just an English patron saint. He's actually a patron saint of Bulgaria, of England, of Georgia, Portugal, Spain, and Ethiopia. And the depiction that we have of St. George and the dragon here is taken from an Ethiopian church in Lalibela. And that you can see that apart from the obvious, sort of the people in it looking Ethiopian rather than Western in this in this sort of wonderful, sort of very vivid and dramatic depiction. The story is largely the same, and it was this story of the dragon that was added on to the existing knowledge and sort of the Christian martyrdom of St. George around the medieval period. Actually also followed the story of St. George, and it's quite interesting that this was picked up on by a lot of the individual cultures and the countries that depict him as a patron saint. So as well as the story of St. George himself and what we know to be the true story of his beheading passing through all of these countries, and his Christian message spreading, also the myth and legend of the dragon followed him, which I just think is so interesting, and it really shows how our culture and our stories can be spread far across the globe. So I thought I would include that today. So like I said, we start to get visual depictions of St. George with a dragon around the same time that this story and the legend of the dragon start to become synonymous with the story of St. George as well in the 15th century, or from the 15th century. And here's a glorious depiction of the story of the dragon as depicted by Paolo Uccello, and this is in the National Gallery's collection. And the story goes that one day St. George came to the city of Selene in Libya, in modern day Libya, which was being terrorized by a dragon, obviously depicted here. And the idea was that the villagers, having tried to placate the dragon by feeding it all of their livestock and facing subsequent devastation through starvation, then turn to the children of the villagers to be fed to the dragon. Why they didn't go for the elderly first, I don't know, that seems to make more sense to me. But anyway, it was the children they decided to start feeding one by one to this terrifying beast. In order to be fair to rich and poor throughout the village, the king ordered that all children should be up for devouration by the beast equally, and straws were drawn. Short straw, as in to draw the short straw, and long straws were held in the hands of all the village children and of someone in the village, and they were picked, and whoever drew the short straw would be fed that day to the dragon. Terror struck through the hearts every day of the villagers, according to the legend, when a child had to be put up for the dragon's dinner, but none so much as when it was the king's own daughter, the princess, who drew that short straw. And for some reason unknown to me, the legend says that she was dressed in her bridal wares and sent to the footlands around the village to meet her death that day. Lo, St. George is passing on his horse and asks the princess what she's doing there, dressed up in her finery, and why on earth she's weeping, to which she replies that she is being fed to the dragon. St. George, remember, this sort of wonderful, heroic Christian figure, says to her, well, he will placate the dragon rather than slay it if she agrees to take it on a leash, which we can see here, and march it down through the village to show the people this kind of act of God almost, that this dragon has been sort of placated, and then he will eventually slay it if all the villagers agree to convert to Christianity. And I think it's sometimes that part of the story that can be a little bit lost, as it rather is in Uccello's sort of famous depiction of the scene, and that we see George sort of immediately slaying the dragon, sticking this lance right through its head, even though the princess already has it on a lead. So it's a bit of a mismatch of different parts of the narrative here. And actually that Christian element, where the villagers all agree to convert to Christianity in return for the eventual slaying of the dragon, is a little bit lost in this more secular depiction. Now, what we know about Uccello is that he was an artist who was also a mathematician and was very interested in linear perspective. And that's possibly one reason why that you see this wonderful shape of the dragon mimicking the shape of the cave, and this wonderful linear perspective running into the distance, why that perhaps became more of interest to this artist than talking about the Christianity behind that as well. A slightly later depiction, a 16th century depiction, you can see that the story of St. George has been told a lot more dramatically. Here we have the princess, sort of absolutely nothing to do with the narrative, running away in horror as St. George again lances this dragon right in front of her, as one of the other villagers, quite evidently not a child as per the legend, is splayed out on the floor in front of us here as she runs away from this horrific scene, sort of one of the dragon's previous snacks there in the foreground. What's interesting about this depiction is that the Christian element of the story is absolute in Tintoretto's depiction. Almost a third of the whole picture space has been taken up by God bursting forth through the clouds in this wonderful halo of sunlight. And this sort of tells the viewer immediately that it's no accident that St. George was riding through the Libya at the time that the dragon needed to be slain, but actually that in itself was an act of God, and therefore converting to Christianity is, you know, the way forward. And we see that very much as we are invited to move through the dramatic picture space up towards the light in this this composition. And in fact, this Tintoretto panel, again now in the collection of the National Gallery in London, was actually originally made to be an altarpiece. We think probably an altarpiece for a private chapel based on the size of it, rather than an altarpiece for a church. But even so, it's the devotional element of this depiction of St. George which is absolute. It's quite different to the Uccello drawing, as you can see, being a little bit later, and also made in Venice. Tintoretto actually took his name. It's not his family name at all, but his father was made dyes in Venice, and Tintoret was the name for a dyer, and so he took his name from that. But colour was particularly important to father and son, as Tintoretto took that idea of the Venetian painters, which was the colour and expression were a lot more important than form and narrative in their compositions. And you see this composition is a lot looser, it's a lot more expressive, and there's far more kind of symbolism through the colours, which all direct our eye upwards. You can see this wonderful red in the princess's sash, which moves up through the red of St. George here and takes us up to the sunlight. One of De Morgan's contemporaries, Edward Burne-Jones, a designer and artist who was a contemporary of William Morris's at university and decided to direct his life through association with the Birmingham School and the arts and crafts movement to being a chief designer of the late Victorian period. And here is his unusual for him oil painting of the scene of St. George and the dragon. You can see that this again is quite a different depiction of the story, as we have the dragon being slayed again by the chivalric knight. But actually Burne-Jones presents us with a bit more of a dreamlike composition of this, as we see the princess almost in prayer-like form, and the sort of very soft way that the oil has been handled on the painting, called sfumato, which gives a lovely blurry, like I said, dreamlike quality to the piece. And what I love about this one is that it is very much an adventure in texture for this artist, who we know worked across a range of craft and fine art and painting. And actually the way he's depicted the scales of this dragon to mimic the shining armor of the knight, I think was probably one of his chief objectives in creating this picture. It also has a lovely dynamism to it though, as we see this wonderful diagonal line across the composition there. But again, this picking up on the idea of medieval chivalric knights was very much central to the arts and crafts movement, who wanted to look back to that art of the past to create an art of the future in a reaction against industrialization. And it was William de Morgan was also a chief figure in that arts and crafts movement. And rather unusually, I suppose, for people who are very familiar with de Morgan's work, is this painted panel. I say that because De Morgan is best known, I think, probably to everyone in this meeting, as a chief designer of ceramics of the arts and crafts movement, and yet we're not looking at a ceramic here at all. As I've said, it's a painted panel. Again, his depiction of the story is pretty true to the legend rather than the Christian elements of it that we saw in Tintoretto. He's much more along the Burne-Jones lines of using this as a narrative piece to evoke the medievalism that the arts and crafts movement sought to express. We have here St. George in his wonderful full suit of armour, bowing down to the king, with the princess holding the dragon behind him there, attended by a footman. There's a sword in the side of the dragon, but he's looking rather glum. And it's a wonderful, characterful dragon that De Morgan does so brilliantly throughout his career, which is to attach these very human characteristics to his animals, to give them this, you know, wonderful expressions. And here we have these villagers very much dressed in sort of wonderful medieval Renaissance costume, the rich and the poor joining together to celebrate the end of this horrible crisis by this wonderful hero in the middle. So a wonderful oh, have I got you back? I've got some comments that the sound has broken up. How long ago? The whole section on William de Morgan. Okay, let's go back to the start. If you poor signal, okay, that's my internet then, if that's happening for everybody. Bear with me 1 second. I'm going to try and change the internet connection to a different one that I have here at home and see if that works any better. So I may go completely, but I should come back. Okay, have I still got everybody? Great. There's now some lawn mowing going on outside as well. You really are up against it when you do this sort of thing from home. I do apologise, everybody. Let's go back to the start of the William de Morgan section, and I'll run through that quickly again to anybody who missed any of that. I will shut the window as well. Do bear with me. Okay, let's try again. So as we saw with the Burne-Jones piece, the very sort of Christian narrative really is lost in these Victorian reimaginings of medieval legends, as they were interested in looking back to this time as one of labour, which was a labour for art forms, which gave agency and individuality to the workforce, and they were very much reacting against industrialization. You know, they saw these huge booming cities, factories springing up all over the place. And I think the idea of recreating the art of the past, whether visually or through the methods that they used, which I'll come on to a little bit later in this talk, they really did want to celebrate the idea of the past being beautiful. And as we saw with Burne-Jones's depiction of St. George and the Dragon, his very dreamlike creation, we see in De Morgan his use of this narrative, I think because it looks so spectacular when you have the Renaissance costumes, the hard steel coolness of the knight's costume, mixed with this scaly dragon, and the whole bravadery that he could put into this scene was probably what actually appealed to De Morgan when he was decorating this cabinet. And to have something which sort of really engages with that medieval period is an ode to the handmade fashion in which the whole painted panel was put together, and the cabinet, which we'll see, was made. So De Morgan's depiction puts St. George right at the centre. He's kneeling down in front of the king, and you can see the king welcoming him with open arms as the rich and the poor follow behind, and these are the people, of course, which are going to agree to convert to Christianity. But De Morgan doesn't seem as interested in that as an excuse to experiment with how he depicts fabric, drapery and costumes, these beautiful rich robes of the king. You can see the pattern there that we know he's so adept at creating through his ceramic designs has been draped wonderfully over the folds in the rich fabric. We also have his depiction of this beautiful, cool hues of the metal suit of armour that the knight's wearing. But my favourite is this rather glum-looking dragon, sword in his side, on a leash, tied to the princess that he should have been having as a snack. It's the dragon's expression is just so marvellous, like I said, for looking rather glum. And De Morgan was such a brilliant master of imbuing his characters, and his animal characters in particular, with human characteristics to make them so very appealing. And that's exactly, I think, what we see in the dragon here. As I've said, it's a painted panel for a beautiful cabinet, which is in the De Morgan Foundation's collection. It's made of ebonized wood and it's inlaid with gold in this wonderful, again, sort of quite medieval style decoration, which involves the flattening, formalizing and stylizing of flowers. It was supposedly made as a china cabinet, i.e. to show off ceramics, which maybe is a narrative that was attached to it after it was used for that purpose by William's sister-in-law, who founded the De Morgan's collection. She calls it a china cabinet anyway, but I mean, it's got these two big, beautiful windows in, so it's obviously made to be decorative and to show off the decorative art, so probably ceramics. It was designed by De Morgan's friend, William Morris, the chief kind of proponent really of the arts and crafts movement. And it was certainly his reaction against shoddy, in his opinion, machine-made objects of art and furniture and decorative objects that he'd seen at this kind of celebration of industry at the Great Exhibition in 1851. And his looking back to medieval furniture, design, interiors, absolutely comes through in this beautiful cabinet. You can see that from the shapes here, this sort of Gothic revival archways underneath the cabinet, the way that the legs have all been worked, the whole style of the piece really, and how it's arranged and put together is absolutely of the period, and his interpretation of that and what a medieval cabinet would be. So I think in this case, that's why De Morgan has chosen to depict the scene of St. George, because it fits in so beautifully with the overall aims of what Morris was trying to achieve through his piece of furniture. However, I've already mentioned De Morgan's humour, and we know that Morris shared this amazing sense of humour with De Morgan. The two actually met through an introduction by an artist called Henry Holliday at Morris's studio at Red Lion Square in 1863. And at that point, Morris dressed up in full vestments and played on a regal whilst he explained to De Morgan the significance of stained glass making. So that just really shows off the humour that the two Williams shared as well. And that can absolutely be seen in this cabinet. When it's turned on its side and the top of the cabinet's looked at, you can see that as well as showing the story of St. George and the dragon, there's actually a hidden dragon in the top of the cabinet, and we see his eye staring out at us here if we've spotted him, the curl of his nostrils and his snout, and then this wonderful row of teeth also inlaid just above the floral motif, which I just think is so comical. And I wonder if anyone actually spotted that before it was pointed out, because I certainly never had done until it was pointed out to me. But I think this really shows what was at the crux of the friendship between arts and crafts practitioners. You know, it wasn't just, they didn't take themselves too seriously, and even though they really threw themselves into making this sort of lost medieval art, it was always done, I think, with a bit of a lighter side. This wasn't the only piece of furniture that William de Morgan is known to have decorated. There are two. If anyone else knows of any more, I'd be really keen to hear about them. But as it goes, we know of two. And this one is in the collection of the William Morris Gallery in Walthamstow. It was a piece of furniture designed by Philip Webb, with the panels, again, by William de Morgan to sort of decorate the outside of the cabinet. This one has two different scenes on it, and they're taken from mythology. So we have Pan playing his pipes and a young Bacchus there playing some sort of harp or lute on the left-hand panel. So again, you know, from De Morgan's perspective, these are really well-used narrative scenes that can be used to sort of decorate and lift pieces of furniture. They work in the format that he wanted them to. There's nothing in there that's sort of particularly you know, a moralizing message. They're scenes that are there to be either comical or beautiful or engaging, and scenes that very much get to the crux of the ideals that, with which he was working. I mentioned that this cabinet is in the collection of the William Morris Gallery, but despite them ending up in different collections today, they actually have a joint provenance. So both of the pieces of furniture were supposedly created for a friend of De Morgan, Horatio Lucas. William Morris cabinet was sold back to Morris & Co. by his daughter, whereas the De Morgan cabinet, the Black Dragon ebonized cabinet, came back to the De Morgan Foundation's collection in the 1920s when that was purchased by Wilhelmina Sterling, De Morgan's sister-in-law. Horatio Lucas was quite a famous etcher and printer, and his work is held in collections of the British Museum, quite a number of his works there. This print of an etching has recently been identified by William Waters as being De Morgan in his studio, and it's been quite an amazing find, really, because we see De Morgan at work at an easel. Even though the kiln is there, it's very much in the background, and even though the plates are there, they're not being worked on, they're finished. And I think this really gives us an extra insight into how De Morgan was perceived, particularly in his early career. So before he began his ceramic pottery business in 1872, what his interests were and what he was painting. And it almost looks to my eye that what he's working on here, I mean, it's clearly an oil painting, but it's quite similar in composition to the two figures from mythology that we have here. And we know that De Morgan was a brilliant artist. It's just that sadly, his easel work and his painting isn't quite as well known as his ceramic work is. So that's a little bit of an insight into that for you. Of his known oil paintings, the Sorcerer, or the Alchemist's Daughter, is probably the most finished and sort of the one that shows off his skill best. Unfortunately, this was actually lost in a fire in 1991, so we only have this photograph of it, but it's still enough to show us that he was obviously quite rigorous at his depiction of patterns of fabric, as we saw in the King's outfit in the St. George cabinet. And you can see here that his figures do have a lot of similarity with the cabinet, particularly in the arrangement of this castellated background and this quite Italianate feel to the thing, and the Renaissance dress that the figures are wearing. I mean, to my mind, this figure here could almost be Titian. He always would wear a skull cap and had this long beard, so that's very much then an ode to the Renaissance painting that we know De Morgan would have studied in his time as a student at the Royal Academy. Another early work, or a painting by William De Morgan, is this one of Tobias and the Angel. So here we have him depicting now biblical scenes. So as well as the legends that he depicted, De Morgan spent a time depicting a number of religious scenes, and these were entered into exhibitions at the Dudley Gallery to their watercolour exhibitions in 1866 and 1867. But this one in particular, like I said, shows the story of Tobias and the angel, where the archangel Raphael comes to Tobias, the son of a blind father, and takes a fish from the waters for him and tells him that if he uses the gall of the fish, he will be able to cure his father's eyesight. This sort of miracle emerging in this beautiful watercolour in front of us. But I wanted to draw your attention to the fish here, because much like with the dragon, De Morgan always includes this kind of quite fantastical creature, and rather than it sort of being a very ordinary fish, you know, he's not painted that from life. He's created this sort of quite beastly looking monstrous fish, which of course comes through later in his depictions for ceramics, and of course in his work, particularly on dragons, where he had free reign really to make up what these imagined creatures looked like. Another reason that De Morgan may have turned to religious subject matter, it's quite unusual for him to do that, given that his father was completely agnostic, and we know that De Morgan sort of didn't particularly practice Christianity himself. He went on to marry his wife Evelyn De Morgan in a registry office rather than in a church, going very much against the grain of the time. But the reason for that was probably from his commissions. So after De Morgan had dropped out of the Royal Academy schools in around 1863, at the time he met William Morris, he started designing stained glass for alongside De Morgan & Co. and for a number of other notable stained glass manufacturers at the time. One of his greatest creations is a window for St Michael's Church in Lustre in Staffordshire, and the De Morgan Foundation is fortunate enough in its collection to have this fantastic full-scale cartoon. It's almost life-size, so the figure of St Michael is almost life size, same size as me basically when I'm stood up. And here we have St. Michael defeating the dragon. St. Michael's mentioned 3 times in the book of Daniel, and the idea that Michael was an advocate of the Jews became so prevalent that in spite of prohibition against angels as intermediaries between God and his people, Michael has come to sort of occupy a key place in Jewish liturgy. In the New Testament, Michael leads God's armies against Satan's forces in the book of Revelation, where during the war in heaven, he defeats Satan. And that is usually how we see St. Michael depicted. It's quite usual in biblical art or in religious art, particularly of Christian nature, that evil or the devil will be depicted as a dragon or serpent-like beast, and that's very much how we see it depicted in this St. Michael window. They've got this sort of wonderful body of the dragon wrapped right around the legs of St. Michael as he comes in and absolutely defeats it. Sanctuaries started to be built to St. Michael by the Christians from the 4th century, and he started to become seen as a healing angel and a protector and the leader of the army against the forces of evil. And that's absolutely how he's depicted in this quite beautiful study by William de Morgan. So his interest in dragons in this sense and his use of them in his artwork is very much for their religious properties, due to him making the commissions for the stained glass windows. This window was made and is mercifully still in position. So if you're near Staffordshire, then I urge you to visit St. Michael's Church and see this fantastic window. It was a notable piece of work at the time. It was written about by J.P. Seddon in the Building News, noted for its rich colour and the background being particularly well treated. And if you squint a little bit, I don't have a zoomed in photograph, you can see that we have these wonderful sunflower motifs, which are typical, again, of the arts and crafts movement, but of De Morgan's ceramic tiles that he moved on to after his stained glass. So a wonderful sort of contemporary note on the windows there. Another depiction of St. Michael was created by William de Morgan, probably for St. Philip's Church in Stepney, as late as 1875. It was thought to be lost until very recently, when it's sort of made its way onto the market again. And this picture was kindly sent to me by Alistair Cox, who is an architectural photographer, particularly interested in pre-Raphaelite stained glass. And here you can see that the dragon has taken on a form quite different to how we've seen De Morgan deal with dragons so far. It's become a 7-headed beast, and the teeth on this thing, I mean, you wouldn't like to get on the wrong side of them. I think it's quite interesting that in this piece of glass, St. Michael sort of looks like he's not really managing very well. You can see that the heads are all curling round his body. His sword's raised, but he's not quite defeated the dragon yet. And how he's going to quite manage that remains anyone's guess. So it almost feels like in the imagery for this depiction of St. Michael, that perhaps De Morgan's maybe letting his secular values come through a little bit more. He's become more creative with the use of the dragon, rather than true to wanting the Christian nature of the story to be particularly depicted, because rather than being this great hero against evil, there almost seems to be more of a balance between good and evil in this depiction. But maybe that's just me reading a little bit too much into it. Since I've mentioned the wonderful photograph provided to me for this talk, I also just wanted to let you know that so much research, so much wonderful and new research has been done on William de Morgan's stained glass, including the St. Michael windows I've talked about, by the art historian William Walters, photographed beautifully by Alistair Cox, and this is now for sale on the De Morgan Foundation's website, or directly through the Seraphim Press, which is Alistair's company. But I can't recommend that more highly. It's a beautiful book that really goes into that history of De Morgan's stained glass. It was from stained glass that De Morgan began, I think, his interest in ceramics, particularly through lustreware. So he noticed during the process of staining glass that if a kiln had become starved of oxygen when silver nitrate was being used to stain glass yellow, then the stained glass would end up with an iridescence on it. And whilst that's not really ideal for stained glass. It reminded De Morgan of some of the examples of lustreware he'd seen in collections such as the British Museum from early Iran, from Syria, and later examples from Spain and Italy before the process seemed to have been forgotten about in the 16th century. With these two ideas in mind, De Morgan basically set about looking to reinvent the lost art of lustre glazing. It's a complex process which requires a copper or silver oxide being pasted onto a pre-fired ceramic, usually with a tin ground, which was an old Iranian way of doing it. And then this is fired in a kiln starved of oxygen so that the oxygen in the lustre glaze painted onto the ceramic surface reacts with the air in the kiln under the extreme temperatures and reduces the metal particles down to be embedded in the glaze, and that gives us this wonderful iridescent sheen on the finished ceramic surface. This Ouroboros, and I'll get onto that plate by William de Morgan, was made in lustreware, probably in around 1872, so very early in his years at the helm of the ceramics business De Morgan and Co., which he founded that year. It's a clever technique which uses wax resist. So you can see that the large portion of the dragon's spine here, its facial features, and the way that the lustre glaze has been painted on is so incredibly detailed. It must have required such a delved hand to do it, but it's actually the lustre that's in the negative space, even more difficult to do. But what I believe De Morgan's done on this dish, and in another vase in our collection, where you can see again the lustre decoration being sort of underneath a secondary pattern, making that so incredibly difficult to do, is the wax resist technique. So the primary pattern is painted on in wax, whether that's the net or the body of the Ouroboros, and then the lustre is painted completely over that as one solid layer, or in this example as the decoration of the fish. And then when the ceramic is put into the kiln, the heat melts the wax and you're left with your sort of two patterns side by side. So a wonderful technique that De Morgan used to great effect from quite early in his processes. Now, what is the Ouroboros? This ancient symbol represents infinity, and one of its first known uses is on Tutankhamun's tomb, as you can see here. It's often a dragon, or as in this example, a snake, which is drawn in a circle, eating its own tail. As we know, these reptilian creatures and snakes, they shed their skin, so they're already sometimes used as a symbol of rebirth and renewal, but presented in this circular shape, along with the sun god Ra, who you can see here just by this chap's leg on the side of Tutankhamun's tomb. It comes to represent the life cycle, and this symbol was used to represent infinity for millennia after its first known use. It's quite interesting then that De Morgan picks up on it for one of the first ceramics he ever makes at his new pottery. And I think a lot of that can sort of be looked at as him making a final gesture to the brilliant work of his father, the mathematician Augustus de Morgan, who spent most of his life working on logic and reason in mathematics. He was the first professor of mathematics at University College London and held that position for his whole life from the age of just 21. So that just shows you how sort of exceptional he was. In order to present his quite difficult theories on logic, reason, including his subjective infinity, to the popular masses, Augustus de Morgan wrote widely and published his works quite cheaply, so that the masses could enjoy his mathematics. And in order to explain his theories in layman's terms, he would draw tiny sort of critters across the pages, which is again a lovely link to his son, but also he wrote poems. So this is based on a Jonathan Swift poem, and you can see there, great fleas have little fleas upon their backs to bite them, and little fleas have lesser fleas, and so ad infantatem. So this wonderful way of sort of putting quite colloquially how infinity works, and I think that's just so wonderful. And De Morgan's kind of quite visual depiction of an Ouroboros made in the year that William's father died is probably a little bit of an ode to him. Or it could be. He could also have been interested in the symbolic Ouroboros, because it's quite often used in a symbol of alchemy, and that's quite an ancient use of the symbol as well as using it in infinity. And one of the main reasons for that is that it was used in the Chrysopode of Cleopatra, a brief alchemical text written on a single piece of parchment dating from the 11th century, which includes lots of runes and symbols and the symbol of the Ouroboros. And in this sense, it was used to symbolize the alchemical production or the process of trying to produce gold from base metals. So maybe De Morgan's having a bit of a laugh with us because, of course, the gold lustre colour that we see in this place isn't created by gold at all. It's actually a silver oxide that goes yellow in the firing process to appear like gold lustre. So I wonder as well whether that was another sort of way of De Morgan's humour coming through as he uses this ancient alchemical symbol to present his own sort of almost philosopher's stone-like creation of gold from a different metal. Here we have a really wonderful dragon tile panel by De Morgan in the Foundations collection. You can see it's a beautiful sort of winged and feathered beast. It's quite different from the scaly dragons that we might associate with. And it's surrounded there by carnation flowers. Now, I'm sure everyone here knows, but a carnation flower certainly wouldn't ever grow bigger than your fist. So he's really playing here with our imagination and our expectations of scale. We would always, I think, imagine a dragon to be this huge ferocious creature from legends like the one of St. George. But here, De Morgan's presented it in a way that we can't quite tell the difference between fantasy and reality. Are the carnations just there for decoration, or are they indicative of a scale? And if so, that makes the dragon almost handheld and, to my mind, quite a sweet little thing. So that's worth thinking about as well. The colourway in this panel is particularly of interest to us because it's so out there, if you will, for De Morgan's practice. Very much based on Italian and Spanish Maiolica ware from the 17th century. So this used that beautiful yellow colour with the cool blues and greens against it that give them that really distinctive colourway. And I think De Morgan was really influenced by that in some of his ceramics from the later part of his career, certainly around the 1890s. And here I've managed to find an example of St. Michael. So slaying this, in this case, this sort of horrible sort of dragon human-like form of the devil incarnate at its feet. But that gives you an idea of the sort of ceramics, these beautiful hand-painted coloured ceramics De Morgan was perhaps looking to in his dragon. I think it's also interesting to note that whilst sometimes they held great symbolic significance for De Morgan, or he was using them for their narrative properties to really portray a different life and a different time, De Morgan was also probably interested in this animal because it was make-believe, and therefore he could manipulate its form to fit in whichever shape and size he required to show off the ceramics that he was making. He was certainly an artist who had a certain mathematical sensitivity of his own, possibly inherited or instilled in him by his father. But this dragon really shows that off. Despite it having this wonderful rounded body and a really thick, long serpent-like neck, the dragon is fit very neatly into the four walls of this ceramic tile. And to that end, I think we can see him as an artist who really understands how to decorate. It's just a fantastic way of making something look so circular whilst being fit inside a square tile. And of course he does that with his pattern making as well. Here's a ceramic tile panel which manipulates the dragons so that they become almost floral in this repeat pattern. We have sort of these quite sort of bird-like dragons, as well as these ones that are sort of more mammalian, but yet they're attached together in these wonderful swirling vines with these leaf arrangements to make a repeat pattern. And that, to my mind, is absolute testament to De Morgan being an astute mathematician, is the idea that he can take an individual square and understand the qualities and the measurements and the ratios needed to create on one tile what's then symmetrically reproduced on another, so that when they're installed together in a panel or on a wall like this, the whole pattern works together. So that's just another example of how he uses the dragons not for their symbolism, but rather for their decorative qualities. Mentioned the arts and crafts movement being one that looked back to medieval look and aesthetic, but also one that that really wanted to reproduce a medieval way of creating art, i.e. one craftsman takes control of the whole process of making a beautiful object rather than them working on one individual bit over and over again, i.e. exactly what happened with factory working to make that more efficient, and through efficiency you lose beauty, or so the arts and crafts movement thought. And this dragon, this is one dish. This is the front on the left and the reverse on the right. And what De Morgan's done here is pick and choose elements of the dragon in order to decorate the whole form of the dish. And I just think it's such a clever design. So on the front, in the recess in the middle there, we have a dragon, again, used and manipulated so that it becomes absolutely circular, even to the flick of its tail. But the dragon here is surrounded by these lovely owls in a floral arrangement. Then if we look at the reverse of the plate, De Morgan's absolutely taken the stylization of the animals to the extreme so that they almost become abstract. And he has owls here with their wings tucked around their face, in between dragon's talons, with a wonderful dragon's eye or talon. I mean, it's so hard to tell, but another element of that dragon design in the middle. And what he's done here is ask us to consider the front and back of the plate in equal measure. They've been decorated in equal measure, which really opposes and goes against the fashion of the time for printed or transfer ceramics, which would of course only have dealt with the front of the plate. So this is showing you that holistic approach to one person creating the full ceramic and seeing that design process through, but also considering the back of the piece to make it in itself a holistic work of art. Again, we see De Morgan's absolute attention to detail in this dragon bottle. You see, again, the rounded form of the dragon to fill the bulbous bottle before the snake, a long thin animal, is used to decorate the long thin neck. And De Morgan does that so well in so many of his ceramics, so it's certainly something to look out for, is how he considers the form of the piece as well as the surface decoration for it, whether that's through dragons or through some of his other creatures as well. I think a final note to end on is this wonderful letter, which is actually in the collection of Whitwick Manor, and we have a facsimile copy in the De Morgan Foundation's collection. A note to the child of a friend, my dear little Fanny. William responds to her letter to him that she's been to visit the zoological gardens, and De Morgan asks whether she's seen the creature he has drawn here, which of course there's no way she would have done. And what he's doing there is once again showing his humour. And as you turn over the page, you see the rest of this long, impossible dragon wearing its Wellington boots. And, you know, if you ever wanted a sense, I think, of De Morgan's sweet nature, his generosity to others, but also his quiet humour, then I think it can be seen in this letter. And again, you know, it shows off his how the fantasy appealed to him and how he could use that to navigate his way through everyday life. Thank you so much. Thank you for bearing with me there where the sound wasn't particularly good and the internet connection wasn't particularly brilliant either. We've managed to get through the whole thing undisturbed as well, even though I've got lots of building work going on in the house. So that has been quite a blessing as well. But no, thank you so much for bearing with me. It's not always easy doing these things from home. If anyone's got any questions about De Morgan's designs, dragons, furniture, stained glass, then I'm absolutely happy to take them. I will do that through the chat box to sort of really help with the dodgy internet that we already know I'm experiencing today. But yeah, please do pop your comments in the box here. So an interesting comment from Alora about it being interesting that Tintoretto loses the princess's agency. So she's running away from the dragon rather than holding it by the chain as she was doing in the Uccello drawing. Yeah, so she's not an active part in it at all. You see her fleeing away. And also, I suppose, she's sort of fleeing away from the act of God as well, whether that's because she looked sort of decorative at the front of the canvas, or a comment on sort of women's place in religion. I'll leave that to you to decide. I did recommend a book. Bear with me, I'll put a link to our website to buy the book. Sorry, just have to watch me tapping away whilst I try and do that. So the web, yeah, that's one. The web page link in the chat box will take you to the De Morgan online shop, where you can order the book on stained glass. It also gives you a review in there of the piece, and some sort of other information about what's contained in it. But yeah, I really can't recommend it more highly. I was going to say if my copy was on this shelf, but I don't think it is, unfortunately, so I can't show you the pictures. Lots of lovely thank yous. Oh, a question. For lustreware, what is the silver oxide mixed with, please? So that would have been mixed together into ground down into a powder, mixed together with a bit of clay slip, and sometimes a water or a gum arabic, so an adhesive to keep all of the pigments together, and then that's painted on to the tin glazed surface. Depending on the artist, that can sometimes be covered with a transparent glaze after the second firing. Very complex process. Do I know who the female model was in the Byrne Jones painting? No is the short answer. Let's have another look at it. I don't think I do in this case, I'm afraid. No, it's not. I mean, lots of Byrne Jones's faces are so generic and so much of a type. It's quite an early painting, 1866. Yeah, I'm going to go with no on that one, but it's in the collection of the Art Gallery of New South Wales, so you can have a look at it on their website, and they might allude to the model on there. So no, apologies about that. Currently, the location of the well, that's a difficult question, the location of the St George cabinet. When our museums reopen, it will be at Cannon Hall in Barnsley. I'm just sort of in the middle of moving it there at the moment, but that's where it will be on display when we're, fingers crossed, 17th of May, when everything reopens, the cabinet will be on display. There we go. There's the building work, if you can hear that, at Cannon Hall in Barnsley. Thank you. Any more questions for anyone else? Just having a look back through early comments to make sure I've got everything. So another question for the Byrne Jones, what was the Dreamy technique for the background? So where I mentioned he'd used his oil paint and he uses quite a dry paint and it's quite blurry. It's called sfumato, which is an Italian word meaning smudged. So you see that a lot in the work of Da Vinci, for example, where his beautiful faces almost look like they're blending into the background. So it gives everything a sort of very ethereal quality, to my mind. Thank you. Thank you for everyone's lovely comments. I did say that I would finish by 1, so I think everything's getting, the circular saws come back out, so the sound's going to be absolutely interrupted, really and truly. So I'll love you all and leave you there. Thank you so much for joining me today, and thanks again for your lovely comments about us featuring on Google's homepage. Let's hope it brings us lots of attention, and I hope to see you for one of our talks again soon. Thank you very much, everybody.